Today, our stories take place in Mexico, where apparently some people have encountered sinister spirits, disturbing creatures, and more. By the way, what country or location would you like to hear scary stories from next? Let me know in the comments. Enjoy these allegedly true scary stories from Mexico, and be sure to send me your terrifying experiences at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. Also, go follow, review, and rate my new podcast, Tales from the Break Room, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcasting app. It's all about people's scariest work experiences, and the next episode comes out next Tuesday at 8 a.m. Central. This one features a vile encounter with the worst kind of neighbor, the kind with a disgusting past and even nastier plans for the person working from home next door. You won't want to miss it. Now, let's begin. The Forever-Mare, from The Encounter. This story starts when I was around the age of 4. I was living in Mexico at the time in a small pueblo in Chihuahua. It was composed of about 100 people. This pueblo is divided by a main road that led to 2 towns. That was the only paved road, too. The rest were dirt roads. My mother and I were living at my grandpa's house when these events began. The house was situated in a 3-way intersection. There was a house that was on the other side of the intersection. This was my aunt's old house before she moved to the US. I had never entered that house. In all honesty, it looked like your average horror movie house. The windows were broken, most of the wood was rotten, and the clay from the walls had begun to fall off. I'd never really thought or paid much attention to it until one night. I was just beginning to fall asleep in my cold bed, the only source of heat coming from a wood oven. I drifted off to sleep at last, and my dreams started off normal, but as it progressed, it took a strange turn. I was sitting on the top of my grandpa's house looking around when I got an uneasy feeling deep in my gut, a feeling that I have only rarely felt. I kept looking around and something caught my eye. My aunt's house. There was someone, or at least something in it. I shifted my attention to the old run-down house, and I was shocked. From broken window to broken window, there was a figure moving. As I blinked, I felt relief. Opening my eyes, I found myself then inside that house. There were tattered clothes over old furniture, a musky smell filling my nose, cobwebs everywhere. The environment outside changed too, from a bright day to night. It felt humid, and there was thick fog outside the house with the moonlight peering in through the windows casting shadows all over. I began to get that uneasy feeling again, that I was being watched, but with so many shadows, I couldn't tell what was watching me. I began to wander around the house. A strong smell began to fill my nose, but I couldn't identify what it was. As my young mind kept me wandering around, I found the smell seemed new compared to everything else in the house. As I walked over the rug, it sounded to be hollow, so I lifted up the rug and to my surprise, there was a hatch underneath. My 4-year-old muscles struggled to lift the large wooden hatch. After finally being able to open it, I laid down on the dusty floorboards, struggling to stand as my body ached. I leaned over the open hole in the floor that I'd just opened. There was just an abyss, emptiness. I couldn't seem to look away though. I just kept on looking into it, until finally, yellow eyes appeared from the dark. Whatever it was, quickly snatched me into the hole, and just like that, I was awake. Now, I wish that's where everything stopped. Growing up, I would have that same nightmare randomly, but never when I was awake. When I was about 8 years old, now living in the US, I went to spend the night with my cousins. They were both older than me and had never experienced anything supernatural. Their parents had left on a date night, so we had the whole house to ourselves. With that in mind, we decided to play hide and seek in the dark. Their living room has a clear view to the street, and to the only street light on the block. As we were just playing around, a light rain appeared out of nowhere. We didn't think much of it. This area was very bipolar with the weather. After about an hour, we had exhausted every hiding spot we could think of. We sat on the couch then, just staring out into the night. The rain kept steady, and we simply kept looking on, when suddenly the night got darker, as the only light on the block just went off. We stared in awe. There was no lightning outside, which could have caused a power outage, plus the nightlight in my cousin's room was still on. All three of us kept looking out the window when I began getting that feeling, the one I'd only gotten in a dream, if one could even call it a dream at this point. I didn't tell my cousins because of the fear of them calling me crazy and possibly making fun of me. I looked around the street when I saw those bright yellow eyes. I kept my eyes on those demonic eyes as I pointed them out to my cousins in hopes I wasn't going crazy. Both looked over. I never took my eyes off of those fiery orbs. I could feel those darned things looking right through me, peering into my soul for what seemed like forever, until one of my cousins finally spoke. "Hey, what is that?" In fright, we all ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind us and turning the lights on. We've never spoken of that event again, but sadly, that wasn't the last time I would see those eyes. I was 12 years old, still having those nightmares, but they were getting less and less frequent. They were still very much there, and those eyes are still burnt into my mind. I'd stayed up way past my bedtime one night, playing Mario on my Game Boy that I'd gotten on my birthday, and eventually I decided it was finally time to go to bed. I crawled into my bed and pulled the covers over my body. I was having a hard time going to sleep. I tossed and turned until finally I found a comfortable position facing my room. I awoke sometime later, suddenly. I looked around and realized I couldn't move. I began to sweat profusely, and I felt a heavy weight on my body as if I was being pushed down deeper into the bed. My eyes started darting around the room, searching for something to look at, until finally, my eyes got caught on something. It was with me. It was on me. I could finally see a figure belonging to those eyes. It was dark, but I could still make out what seemed to be a human, but it was too big and out of proportion. Its small head sat on top of large shoulders, following that down to his arms, which were small but not scrawny. It seemed as if there was only muscle with no skin over it. There was no feeling this time. It was just there. It felt so surreal, but I know that it was real. Then, I don't know how, but I figured I was finally able to go back to sleep. Waking up, I quickly looked around, jolting up to make sure I was no longer under sleep paralysis. I walked to the bathroom and washed up. Looking at myself in the mirror, I noticed bruises on my biceps. I hope that no one ever sees this thing, because if you do, may whatever God you believe in help your soul, because it will never leave you alone. Tall Lady from Chromeskull. This happened when I was in Mexico. My parents are from a little town of over 2,000 people. Over there, they have festivals almost all year round. When it's not in one block, it's on another. They all have like 2 weeks in between before the other one begins. I didn't know this, so one time I asked my cousins, "How come we're not going to a festival?" That's when they told me about the 2-week period. One of our friends remembered that there was a festival going on at a little town nearby, but my cousins were against it because we were only teenagers back then, and we needed a ride over there unless we wanted to walk over 5 acres and through a cemetery. Even so, we settled on going. By then, the sun was already setting, so we ran through the cemetery portion, and we then started our hike through the acreage. We crossed a river and went up a hill. We came out on a dirt road, which leads you straight to town. But by the time we were walking on the road, it was pitch black out, except for the very faint light of the town we could see in the distance. We then made a deal amongst ourselves that we would not be allowed to scare each other, since the walk was already scary enough. Plus, the tall trees on either side of the road were not helping. As we continued walking, one of my friends said there was someone following us. We didn't look back to check. We simply told that friend to stop and to keep walking. But he kept on saying and insisting that there was someone following us, that she was following us. He went on to say that she wasn't even walking. She looked as if she was gliding over the ground. He started to make this noise you make when you start crying, but you're holding it back as best you can. This finally convinced us to turn around. Looking back, we all saw this lady in a white dress. She was following us, and she appeared to be gliding over the ground, just as he had said. We even saw her rise in the air, almost to the height of the trees. That's when we freaked out and began running, yelling, making a mad dash for civilization. Luckily, the town was not too far away. However, she was following us the entire way there. Once we stepped into the light of the town, we looked back, and she wasn't there anymore. We stayed in town, horrified, for the remaining of the festival, and once it was over, we made sure to get a ride back out. Gargoyle-Like Creatures. From Anonymous. This story is true and was also witnessed by 4 of the most sincere and honest people I know, my parents and 2 older siblings. This happened in Mexico, specifically Rio Bravo, Tamaulipas. It was right next to the border with Texas. I was about 5 years old at the time. My older siblings were 11 and 9 years old. It was nighttime, and my dad had just arrived from work. We all headed outside. My dad brought along with him this huge searchlight. My mom said it was like the ones you see in superhero movies. It was so big that it took all the back of the truck. It was maybe 4 feet in diameter. My mom said we were all excited about it, so she asked my dad to turn it on so we could see how it looked. My dad agreed, but he said he would point it towards the sky as it could damage your sight. He did so, and it all looked so cool. You could see the light go extremely high into the sky. At the time, there were some low clouds, and you could see it reflect off of them. My dad was moving the light all over the place, just enjoying the sight. I honestly can't remember much of it. But then they saw them. They say they saw something that they swear is true to this very day. There were 5 creatures with massive wings resembling gargoyles. They said they were coming closer and closer. The closer they got, they could make out huge claws too on both hands and feet. These things were massive, maybe about 10 feet tall. Even though they were high up, they still looked big. They were gray or black in color, and were doing some weird formations and shapes. They came as close as the clouds. Then after a while, they began to go higher, until they eventually disappeared into the higher clouds. Those who remember say they were in disbelief, wondering how that even happened, how that was possible. My mom said they didn't feel threatened at the time, not even afraid, even though that was so surreal. My parents and siblings used to watch Gargoyles, the cartoons. That's how they were comparing them. What makes me believe this was 100% real is that my parents were never the kind of people who would make up such a story, and my 2 older siblings swear they saw it too. I've always wondered if those gargoyle statues all over the world were made by people who once saw these things in real life. Encounter with the Unknown. From Lionel, 10. For most of my childhood, I grew up in the woods. My family had a farm in the middle of the woods in the state of Oaxaca, Mexico. Nighttime walks through the woods were common for my cousins and I, so as a kid, I was never really scared of the woods. Eventually, I moved away from that farm and moved to the United States, which is where I was born. It wasn't until years later, when I was 15, that I went back to visit. One particular night, when I was back for a visit, I was asleep. I woke up at some point to a very uneasy feeling. I noticed then that everything had gone completely silent. Not a single bug could be heard. Being the inquisitive kind of person I was, I went outside to investigate. I thought I might encounter a coyote or something small, but the moment I stepped outside, that uneasy feeling turned into confusion and even fear for what seemed like no reason at all. The entire time, I felt like I was being watched. I scanned the tree line, hoping to see something, but at the same time I was wishing I didn't see anything at all. Then I saw it. In the tree line on the left side of the farm stood a shadowy figure. It was tall and skinny. It had these very thin, horn-like things coming out of its head, and its eyes were piercing red. It looked at me through the tree line, and I was too terrified to move. We stared at one another, until eventually it let out a howl almost like a wolf, but far deeper, followed by a few grunts. But then it turned around and disappeared into the woods, leaving me even more scared and confused than before. Watching me in the dark. From Gus. I'd like to start by saying I'm not religious, but I have experienced things that I can't explain and can only come to the conclusion of the supernatural. This story takes place when I was in my junior year of high school. I'm 21 now. It was almost Christmas, and my parents asked me if I'd like to visit Mexico this year and spend Christmas over there. Of course, I said yes. So off I went for 2 weeks. I went with my cousin's family by car, and we got there about 3 days later. We were visiting distant family. When we made it, we hugged and they cried after finally seeing me after such a long time. It was great. Around 4 days later at night, we were all outside telling scary stories, and I'll be honest, it did creep me out a bit, but I tried not to show it. When it came time for bed, I was kind of nervous because out there it was super dark at night, especially because this is a village near the mountaintops. It's pretty poor there. They do have some streetlights, but they're not that bright. My grandmother was sleeping next to me in a different bed, and my cousins and their parents were in the next room with no door. Around 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., I woke up. I felt cold. When I looked down at my feet, my covers were at my knees, so I got up to get them, but then I looked up a little, and at the end of the bed was a shadow darker than the rest of the room, and it was easily 7 feet tall. Now, I'm not trying to act cool, but I wasn't scared at that moment. I didn't move, though. I was just staring it down. When I moved a little bit, it started to sink into the ground. It was so fast I didn't know what to do, so I closed my eyes. Eventually, I fell back to sleep somehow. The next day, I kept quiet, and I didn't tell anyone about it. Thinking back to this experience, what scares me isn't the shadow being itself. Rather, just how long it was there for. What was it doing before I woke up? And more importantly, why? Why me? It was all so weird. Alien Encounter, 1989. From Art. In the summer of 1989, my father worked for Mexican Airlines in Mexico City. We lived about an hour away from the main city. When he arrived home at 3 a.m., he would usually have a beer to wind down. He owned some land down the hill, and one night he saw these bright lights down on his property. He was thinking it could have been city construction workers. So he went to tell them they were not allowed to build on his land, and he did have the proper documentation to back it up. But he didn't know what he was getting himself into. He suddenly realized there was a parked saucer-looking craft, and the light was emanating from inside this saucer. There was a door open with a ramp down. He then saw 3 beings, what they would call greys. Each of them was 4 feet tall with long arms, big heads, and almond-shaped eyes. Their hands had 3 fingers, and they were wearing tight black suits that looked like scuba diving gear. They were hiding from my father, just off in the bushes, peeking out. My dad hid from them too, and he was in shock. He then proceeded to run back to the house. He said in his opinion, the Greys appeared to be there to charge up their ship. After all, he had seen a wire coming out from the side of the ship, plugging itself into the transformer box in the street. Soon after that, there was a blackout, and they got back in the ship and left. My father went back down the hill the next day, finding weird hieroglyphs and markings on a metallic pole. My father then proceeded to ignore this encounter, knowing no one would believe him. He continued on with his daily life, coming to an agreement to keep this encounter to himself. A month later, he was in bed, and he said the only thing he could move was his eyes. That's when he saw 3 greys next to his bed, watching his entire family. But these greys were different. There were 2 normal-sized ones and a 6-foot-tall one. They seemed to be floating and wearing lab coats. They left and his ears were left ringing. These beings had phased out in a line, if that makes sense. After that, we've had back-to-back encounters. I didn't believe his story until I had my own encounter with a Grey in my room, staring right down at me. They never told me anything, or my father. They would just inspect us. I think they were reading our minds. Warning: the following story contains depictions of animal violence and harm. The Creature of Mexico. From Lewis. I was originally born and raised in Guanajuato, Mexico, in between 2 cities more than 2 hours away in both directions. It's a 1-hour ride down and horseback to the road, where we waited for our ride to town whenever we did decide to go out for food or supplies or candles. Keep in mind, there was no power or electricity where we lived, in the cerro, which means mountain ground. We would simply tie up our horses by the road and wait for the ride. With that being said, things began to happen to my grandfather's animals. One morning, I saw that he was extremely angry. I didn't really know why until I saw that one of his horses had 3 big gashes on its back. It had been attacked. Before this happened, we had 3 dogs, 1 female and 2 males, 2 of which were crossbreeds between German Shepherd and something else. Anyway, 2 weeks before the horse attack, one of the male dogs was killed. Its head was chewed up real bad by something. And the other 2, well, I know it's weird, I'm no animal guru, but I could see fear in them. I mean, they were used to getting in fights with coyotes around here. They were no strangers to fights and other animals. We lived by an arroyo, which means stream, and one night my grandpa heard the horse that was attacked making noises, like it had seen something. Keep in mind the horses would always be tied up, so they wouldn't run off. My grandpa went outside to investigate, and would later say this to my father: whatever it was skinny, big, half the size of the horse itself. It either had no skin, or the strangest skin I've ever seen, and had a long snout, like a dog's, with pointy ears. Its legs were big and long, same as its arms, and it really stank. Grandpa said he took 3 shots at it with a 22mm gun. The creature then ran out into the cerro. My grandpa believes he hit it the first time, but missed the other 2 shots. He admitted that that night when he tried to go to sleep, he couldn't sleep, and he later heard what sounded like a howl the next night. And after that, he said he couldn't sleep right for 2 weeks straight. At that point, he preferred sleeping during the day instead of at night. Eventually, he went over to a relative's house, borrowing a hunting rifle. Time passed by, and he heard from a neighbor that lived 3 miles away that one night while looking for his lost sheep, he encountered something with the same features described by my grandfather before. The neighbor was chased by the creature, but luckily the man was on horseback and he didn't get caught. They to this day sleep with loaded guns at night. However, animals keep turning up missing, and some dogs turn up dead. And sadly, no one has yet to report killing whatever this thing is. The Fireball in the Sky. From Nero, Angelo. I was 13 years old when this happened. I was in Mexico with my parents visiting some relatives. The day was normal at first. Just like every other day, I was spending time with family and just enjoying Mexico. That night we went to church, because the church would give candy and drinks to anyone who came. Then, when it was over, we got into my father's truck, and we started the short drive to my relative's home where we were staying. But when we stopped at the driveway, I saw my family beginning to point at the sky. They were saying, "Bruja," which means witch. They then ran into the house, but me being curious, I looked up. I wanted to know what they were looking at. What I saw that night was a fireball against a dark sky. It was bright, and it was moving away from me. Amazed and a bit unsettled, I turned and went inside with my family. For those who don't know, a bruja is a Mexican witch who can turn into a fireball. They say that if you stare at it for long enough, it'll look like it's getting farther away. But the thing is, it's actually getting closer. Luckily, I never saw it again during the rest of my stay in Mexico. Taxi driver's Nahual story. From FutureCorpse. I recently went to Mexico as a vacation trip and left with souvenirs and a story. It is not my own story, but one from a taxi driver we drove with. The story begins with the taxi driver out late at night taking a night walk. He was relaxed and calm but noticed a weird, rotten smell. He glanced around and saw this weird-looking cat. He thinks nothing more of it because there's a lot of strays in Mexico. That is, until he notices something. The cat has shiny fur. The texture was more like human hair than that of a cat. This cat appeared to be malnourished and thin, and had dark yellow eyes. It had no tail, which is one of the ways you can tell if an animal is a Nahual or not. A Nahual is a human being said to have the power to shapeshift into an animal. The cat stared back at the taxi driver. Mind you, he's a 5'11" guy, and this cat on all fours was as tall as his waist. He then watches this cat stand up and run away like a human. The following day, he goes to get blessed, and the person who was blessing him told him, "You're very lucky. Nahuales don't usually leave humans alone and tend to mess with them before ultimately killing them." For the next couple of weeks, the taxi driver would see human-looking animals, or they would have no tail. As I understand it, Nahuales and skinwalkers can vary in look. More experienced Nahuales and skinwalkers can look more animalistic or human-like, and vice versa. Sometimes he would hear distorted animal screams that were often coyote screams. I'm sorry if the story was either lackluster or boring, but you don't have to believe me. These are the words of our taxi driver. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there, and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.